The son begged for a John Deere STS 9650 in 2003, but the father had the old case repaired. Before we get into this story, I need you to understand something about American agriculture in the early 2000s. This wasn't just another year on the farm. According to USDA Economic Research Service data from that period, farm debt nationwide had climbed to over $180 billion by 2003. The average age of the American farmer had reached 55 years old. And right in the middle of all this, there was a technological revolution happening in the fields that was splitting farming families right down the middle between those who believed the future demanded new equipment and those who remembered what debt had done to their neighbors 20 years earlier during the farm crisis. What I'm about to tell you is built on real documented trends from this era, real equipment specifications, and real financial pressures that thousands of farming families faced. The names and some details are dramatized, but every economic challenge, every piece of machinery mentioned, and every agricultural decision you'll hear about comes straight from the records and from the memories of people who lived through it. The argument started in March, 3 weeks before wheat harvest, in a machine shed outside Hays, Kansas. "Dad, we're losing money every day we run that dinosaur." Michael Brennan was 26 years old, fresh off an agricultural business degree from Kansas State, and he'd spent the last 18 months working the farm alongside his father while running spreadsheets at night that all pointed to the same conclusion. The 1981 case IH 1460 combine sitting in their shed was costing them a fortune in loss efficiency. His father, Robert Brennan, age 58, didn't even look up from the bearing he was repacking on the combine's feeder house. "This machine's got another season in it." "Another season?" Michael's voice cracked with frustration. "Dad, it's got 22 years on it. The John Deere dealership in Salina has an STS 9650. We could lease to own. Do you understand what that machine can do? 750 bushels in the tank, rotary separator system, 300 horsepower, yield mapping, moisture sensors. It would cut our harvest time by 40%. 40%. Robert wiped his hands on a rag that had been the same shade of dark gray for probably a decade. "You know what that machine costs, son? $275,000. But with the lease program, $275,000. Robert said it again, slower. "Your grandfather bought this farm in 1958 for $30,000. The whole farm." This wasn't the first time they'd had this conversation. It wouldn't be the last. Now, if you're not familiar with what was happening in farm equipment technology in the early 2000s, you need to understand this was a watershed moment. The John Deere STS series, introduced in 1998 and refined by 2003, represented the biggest leap in combine technology since the rotary combine was invented. The 9650 STS featured a single rotor threshing and separating system instead of conventional straw walkers. According to John Deere's own specifications, it could harvest up to 4,000 bushels per hour in good conditions, nearly double what a conventional machine from the 1980s could handle. But more than that, it had electronics, computers, GPS capability, the ability to create yield maps that showed exactly which parts of your field were producing and which weren't. For a young farmer trying to compete in an increasingly data-driven agriculture market, it was the difference between guessing and knowing. But here's what the sales brochures didn't talk about as much: the debt. Let me put this in perspective for you. In 2003, the average net farm income in Kansas was around $32,000 per year for operations the size of Brennan's place. They were running 2,400 acres, 1,800 in wheat, 600 in milo, rotating with some ground they'd rest each year. A $275,000 combine represented roughly 8.5 years of their average net income. Even with trade-in value on the old case and favorable lease terms, they'd be looking at payment around $45,000 annually for 6 years. That's more than their entire net income in a bad year. The Brennan farm sat 6 miles east of Hays, right in the heart of Ellis County. Good ground, mostly, heavy clay in spots, but productive when the rain came right. The farmstead itself looked like 10,000 other places scattered across Kansas. A white 2-story house that Robert's grandfather had built in 1924, a red hip roof barn, that was mostly empty now since they'd sold the cattle in '97, 2 steel grain bins that Robert had put up in 1979, and the machine shed where this particular battle Wills was playing out. Michael had grown up watching his father nurse that case 1460 through harvest after harvest. He'd learned to run it when he was 14, sitting beside his dad in the cab, learning to watch the loss monitor, to listen to the engine's rhythm, to feel when the header was cutting too low or the cylinder speed needed adjustment. But he'd also gone to college. He'd sat in agricultural economics classes where professors showed them the data. Farms were getting bigger or going under. Margins were getting thinner. Efficiency wasn't just a buzzword, it was survival. "Let me show you the numbers again," Michael said, pulling a folded spreadsheet from his back pocket. He'd printed this one out 3 days ago. Last harvest, we were down for repairs 6 days total. 6 days. You know what wheat was doing while we were waiting on parts? Shattering in the field. We lost 18 acres to a hailstorm because we couldn't get ahead of the weather. With the STS, we could have cut our harvest window by 2 weeks. Robert finally stood up, his knees popping. He was a tall man, lean from 58 years of physical work, with hands that had permanent calluses and a face that had spent too many years in the sun without much sunscreen. "You finished with that speech?" "It's not a speech, it's math." "Math." Robert nodded slowly. "Let me tell you about math, Mike. In 1982, your Uncle Dave, my brother, he bought brand new International 1480, top of the line. Thought he was set for the future. You know where Dave is now." Michael did know. Everyone in Ellis County knew. Dave's working at the feedlot in Garden City because the bank took his farm in '87. He wasn't a bad farmer. He wasn't lazy. He just had debt when the farm crisis hit. And debt is what separates the ones who make it from the ones who don't. That was 20 years ago, Dad. Interest rates were 18%. It's not the same. It's always the same when you owe money you can't pay back. The conversation ended there, the way it always did. Michael walked out of the shed, got in his truck, and drove the section roads for an hour trying to cool off. Robert went back to repacking bearings on a combine that was older than his son's girlfriend. If you grew up in a farming family, especially if you came of age in the generation after the 1980s farm crisis, you probably recognize this tension. Leave a comment if you remember having this exact argument, or being on the other side of it from your own kids. Because this wasn't just playing out on the Brennan farm. This was happening everywhere. 3 days later, on a Tuesday morning, the case 1460 proved Michael's point in the worst possible way. They were test running the combine, getting ready for wheat harvest that was maybe 10 days out. Robert was in the cab, Michael was watching from the ground, and their hired man, Perry Sutton, 63 years old, been helping with harvest since the mid-'70s, was standing by the grain cart tractor. Robert engaged the separator. The big cylinder inside starting to spin up. That's when they heard it. A sound like a rifle shot, then a screaming metal shriek that made all 3 men flinch. Robert shut it down immediately, but the damage was done. When they climbed up and opened the side panels, they found that the main drive shaft of the threshing cylinder had sheared. Not just cracked, sheared clean through. The shaft itself was a forged steel piece about 3 inches in diameter. It shouldn't have been possible. Well, Perry said, which was about as close to commentary as Perry ever got. Michael didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Robert climbed down, walked around the front of the machine, and just stood there staring at it for a long moment. Then he turned to Michael. "Call Hogan's in Russell. Get a price on the shaft." Michael made the call right there on his cell phone, one of those early Nokia flip phones that barely worked in rural Kansas, but was better than driving to town. Hogan's was a Case IH part supplier that specialized in older equipment. The parts man put him on hold for 5 minutes while he looked it up. "They can get the shaft," Michael said when he hung up. $3,200. 2 weeks delivery, maybe 3. 3 weeks. Robert took off his cap, ran his hand through hair that had gone completely gray in the last 5 years. "We'll be in the wheat in 10 days if this weather holds." Michael saw his opening. "Dad, the dealership in Salina could have us in at $9,650 in 4 days. I called them last week to check." We walk in with the trade-in paperwork. We could be combining by the weekend. But Robert was already shaking his head. Call Marlowe's machine in Hayes. See if Wayne can weld it. Weld a main drive shaft? Dad, that's a stress component. The torque on that thing. See if Wayne can weld it. So Michael called Wayne Marlowe, who ran a machine shop and welding operation out of an old Quonset building on the south edge of Hayes. Wayne had been welding and fabricating for farmers since 1971. If it was made of metal and it was broken, Wayne had probably fixed one before. Bring it in, Wayne said. I'll take a look. They spent the rest of that day pulling the shaft out of the combine, which is not a small job, involves removing about a dozen other components to get at it, and hauling it to town in the back of Robert's pickup. Wayne examined it in his shop, turning the broken pieces in his hands, checking the fracture pattern. She'd been cracked for a while. Wayne said, See here? This is old metal fatigue, probably been propagating for months. Just finally gave up. I can weld this, but I can't promise you it'll hold for a full season. Might hold, might not. What's the might not scenario look like? Robert asked. Shaft breaks again mid-harvest. Probably takes out your cylinder and maybe punches through the housing. You're looking at $20,000-$30,000 in damage. Easy. Plus you're down for a month while you find the parts. Michael watched his father's face. Surely this would be the moment the old man saw reason. How much to weld it? Robert said, $400, about 2 days' work. But Bob, I'm telling you straight. I know what you're telling me, Wayne. Do the weld. They drove back to the farm in silence. Michael didn't trust himself to speak. When they pulled into the driveway, he got out, walked straight to the house, and found his mother, Sarah, in the kitchen putting up vegetables from the garden. He's going to weld the shaft, Michael said. Sarah didn't look surprised. She'd been married to Robert for 33 years. I know. Mom, we could lose the whole harvest. One breakdown in the middle of wheat, and he stopped himself. Why is he like this? Sarah set down her paring knife and looked at her son. She was a small woman, barely 5'3", but she'd held this family together through more than one crisis. You want to know why your father won't buy that combine? I know why. He thinks it's 1985, and he thinks we'll lose the farm if we take on debt. No. Sarah wiped her hands on her apron. He thinks it's 1987, and he remembers what it felt like to watch his brother lose everything. Your father and I were at the auction, Michael. We watched him sell off Dave's equipment, his land, 40 years of his family's history, because Dave bought new equipment right before everything collapsed. Your father has had nightmares about debt for 20 years. That's not stubbornness. That's trauma. Michael sat down at the kitchen table. Outside the window, he could see his father over by the machine shed, just standing there, looking at the empty space where the combine should be. Now, let me give you some context about what farming families were dealing with in 2003, because it helps explain why this wasn't a simple decision. Wheat prices that year were hovering around $3.50 a bushel, which sounds okay until you factor in that input costs were climbing. Fuel was up. Fertilizer was up. Chemical costs were increasing. The margin between profit and loss on a wheat farm was getting thinner every year. Federal Reserve data from that period shows that farm debt-to-income ratios were starting to rise again after declining through the 90s. In other words, farmers were starting to borrow more again, financing bigger equipment, more land, try to achieve economies of scale that will let them survive. But that borrowing brought risk. Always. The welded shaft came back from Wayne's shop on a Friday afternoon. Robert and Michael and Perry spent Saturday reinstalling it, which meant basically rebuilding half the interior of that combine. They had it back together by Sunday evening. Test it Monday. Robert said, if it holds, we'll be ready when the wheat is. Monday morning, they ran the combine for 3 hours. The shaft held. The separator ran smooth. By all appearances, Wayne's well was solid. It's holding, Perry observed. Coming from Perry, that was practically a speech. Michael said nothing. He'd done the math in his head. Even if the shaft held through this harvest, they'd have the same conversation next year, and the year after that. His father was maintaining a machine through sheer force of will, and eventually wasn't going to be enough. That night, Michael sat at the kitchen table with his laptop, pulling up articles about farm equipment depreciation, lease terms, projected wheat yields. His girlfriend, Amanda, they'd been dating for 2 years. She was from Hayes, worked at the hospital, came over and found him staring at spreadsheets. "Still fighting about the combine?" she asked. "It's not about the combine," Michael said. "It's about whether we're going to be farming 5 years from now. Dad's so afraid of debt that he won't invest in what we need to survive. Or maybe he's so afraid of debt because he knows what happens when you can't pay it back." "You sound like him." "I sound like someone who grew up here." Amanda sat down across from him. "My dad, an accountant, Mike. You know how many farm bankruptcies he processed in the late 80s? It wasn't just the farms that went under. It was the businesses that depended on them. The implement dealers, the grain elevators, the cafes in town. When farms fail, everything fails. So what are we supposed to do? Just keep running equipment from the Reagan administration until it literally falls apart in the field?" "I don't know," Amanda said, "but I know your dad's kept this place going for 30 years. Maybe trust that he knows something you don't." Harvest started on June 12th. The wheat was testing at 12.8% moisture, right where you want it. The forecast showed a high-pressure system settling in, which meant good cutting weather for at least 5 days. Every farmer in Ellis County who could roll was rolling. Robert was in the cab of the Case 1460 by 6 a.m., Michael was running the grain cart with the tractor, and Perry was shuttling loads to the elevator in town with the semi-truck. It was the same dance they'd done every June for years. The welded shaft held. First day, second day, third day. The combine ran 16 hours a day, and the shaft held. Michael started to think maybe his father had been right, or maybe just lucky. Then, on the 4th day of harvest, late in the afternoon, everything changed. They were cutting the home section, about a quarter mile from the farmstead, when Michael noticed smoke on the horizon to the west. Not much at first, just a gray smudge against the blue sky. But within 10 minutes it had grown into a dark column, and the wind was picking up, pushing it east, toward them. Michael pulled up alongside the combine and shouted over the engine noise, "Dad, fire!" Robert looked west, and even from 50 feet away, Michael could see his father's expression change. Robert shut down the header, kicked the combine out of gear, and climbed down. "That's the Hutchins place," Robert said. The Hutchins farm was 3 miles west, a big operation running maybe 4,000 acres of wheat. Winds pushing it this way. They could hear sirens now. Fire trucks from Hayes heading west on the highway. But both of them knew what a wheat field fire could do when it got going. In dry conditions with wind, it could move faster than a man could run. Robert pulled out his cell phone. He'd finally gotten one the year before, though he barely used it, and called Perry, who was just leaving the elevator in town. "Perry, we got a fire west of here. I need you to disc a fire break on the west end of the home section. Use the big Steiger and the 30-foot disc. Go now." Then he called Wayne Marlowe. "Wayne, I need every farm in the county that can spare a tractor with a disc. We're going to try to stop this thing before it gets to our place." Within the hour, it looked like half of Ellis County had shown up. This is one thing that hasn't changed in rural America, no matter what decade you're talking about. When there's a fire, people come. They came with tractors, discs, plows, bladders of water in the back of pickups. The volunteer fire department from Hayes was there, and the one from Victoria, and individual farmers with spray rigs full of water. The fire had started in a wheat field on the Hutchins place. They never did figure out if it was a spark from equipment or a lightning strike or what, and with the wind at 15 miles per hour, it was moving fast. By the time the firebreak operation was organized, the fire had jumped a county road and was burning through CRP ground, heading straight for the next section of wheat, which belonged to Robert Brennan. Michael found himself on a tractor he'd never operated before, pulling a disc he'd borrowed from a neighbor, cutting a black strip through standing wheat to try to create a barrier the fire couldn't cross. The smoke was thick enough that he had to wrap a bandana around his face. His eyes were streaming. He could feel the heat from the fire, even though it was still a quarter mile away. Robert was on another tractor, and Perry was on the Steiger running the big disc, and there were 8, maybe 10 other farmers doing the same thing, all of them cutting fire breaks in a line, trying to create a barrier. The fire hit their first break around 7 p.m. For a few minutes, it looked like it might hold. The flames hit the black earth where they disked under the wheat, found nothing to burn, started to peter out. Then the wind gusted, and embers jumped a break and ignited the wheat on the other side. "It's not holding," someone shouted. They fell back to the second break, closer to the farmstead. This one was wider. They had more time, and several farmers with water trucks were wetting down the wheat on the far side. Michael looked back toward the house, where his mother was standing on the porch watching. The machine shed with all their equipment was maybe 300 yards from where they were trying to stop the fire. The Case 1460 was still sitting out in the field where they'd left it. "Dad!" Michael had to shout to be heard over the roar of the fire and the tractors. "The combine!" Robert looked toward where the Case sat, then at the line of fire bearing down on them, then back at his son. There wasn't time to get it out. If someone drove out there now, they might not make it back before fire cut them off. "Leave it," Robert said. "What?" "I said leave it. It's not worth your life." But Michael was already running. He jumped in the pickup truck, drove across the disc ground, pulled up next to the combine. The smoke was so thick now, he could barely see the farmstead. He climbed up into the cab, fired up the diesel engine. It took 3 tries, the old fuel system cranky as always, and got the machine moving. The heat was incredible. He could see flames through the smoke now, close enough that he could hear wheat stalks crackling as they burned. He pushed the combine as fast as it would go, which on that old machine was maybe 5 miles an hour. The smoke was so bad he was navigating by memory, trying to remember where the disc fire break was, where the safe zone should be. The Case 1460 had never seemed so slow. He heard someone shouting his name. The smoke cleared for just a moment, and he saw his father running toward him on foot, and behind his father he saw the fire, close enough now that he could see individual stalks of wheat catching and burning. He got the combine across the fire break, with maybe a minute to spare. Perry met him there with a water truck, and started spraying down the machine while Michael jumped out and stumbled away from the smoke. Robert grabbed him by both shoulders. "You damn fool. That machine's not worth dying for." "It's worth more than you think," Michael said, then doubled over coughing. The second fire break held. The combination of disked earth and water-soaked wheat finally created a barrier the fire couldn't cross. By 10 p.m., the fire crews had it contained. By midnight, they were doing mop-up work, making sure no hot spots remained. The Hutchins place lost about 800 acres of wheat. 3 other farms lost crops. The total damage ran into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. But no one died, no houses burned, and by the grace of good soil and good neighbors working together, they'd stopped it before it could become the kind of catastrophe that makes the national news. Michael found his father sometime after midnight, sitting on the tailgate of his pickup, looking at the Case 1460, which now sat safely in the machine shed. Robert's face was black with soot, his shirt was torn, and he looked like he'd aged 10 years in one evening. "You shouldn't have gone after it," Robert said. "I know." They sat there for a minute, not talking, just listening to the sounds of fire trucks packing up and farmers heading home. "Your grandfather bought this farm in 1958, Robert said finally. "Paid $30,000, which was about twice what anyone thought it was worth. Took him 18 years to pay it off. The whole time we were growing up, every single decision he made was about whether it would help pay off that land. We didn't get new equipment. We didn't take vacations. We wore hand-me-down clothes and ate beans 3 times a week. But by 1976, he owned this place free and clear." Michael had heard parts of this story before, but never quite like this. "Then in 79, I wanted to expand. Wheat prices were good. Everyone was buying more ground, and I thought we should too. Dad said no, said the farm was paid for, said debt was the devil. We had a fight about it, worst fight we ever had. I thought he was being an old fool, stuck in the past." Robert rubbed his face, leaving soot streaks. 3 years later, the farm crisis hit. Every guy I knew who'd borrowed money to expand, they went under, Everyone. Some of them lost everything. Some of them... He stopped. Dave was 38 years old when the bank took his farm. You know what that does to a man. I'm not Uncle Dave, Michael said quietly. I know you're not. You're smarter than me and Dave both. You got that education. You understand things we never did. But smart doesn't protect you from bad luck, Mike. Bad weather, bad markets, bad timing. You could do everything right and still lose if you got debt hanging over your head. Michael looked at the case 1460. That combine's going to cost us money every season we run it. Lost efficiency, downtime, repairs. You know I'm right about that. I know you are, Robert said. I've known you were right since you first showed me those spreadsheets. That John Deere would cut our costs, speed up harvest, probably improve our yields with the yield mapping and all that computer technology. Then why? Because I'm scared, Robert said simply. I'm 58 years old, and I'm scared of losing this place. I'm scared of turning it into something I don't recognize. I'm scared of owing money I can't pay back. And I'm scared that if I say yes to that new combine, I'm saying yes to a whole different way of farming, and I don't know if I can do it. Michael sat with that for a long moment. In all his spreadsheets and efficiency calculations, he'd never factored in fear. You couldn't put fear into a cell on Excel. Dad, Michael said finally, what if we're both right? Robert looked at him. What if you're right that debt is dangerous, but I'm right that we need better equipment to survive? What if the answer isn't all new or all old, but somewhere in the middle? I'm listening. And there, in the aftermath of a fire that had almost destroyed everything, sitting on the tailgate of a pickup truck at 1 a.m, they worked out a compromise. Instead of buying or leasing the John Deere 9650 STS new, they looked for a used one, maybe a 2000 or 2001 model with a few years on it. The technology would still be a massive upgrade from the case, but the price would be $150,000 instead of $275,000. They'd put down everything they could scrape together, keep the loan as small as possible, and structure it so they could pay it off in 3 years if they had to. They'd keep the case 1460 as a backup, fix the shaft right, maintain it properly, but use it as insurance rather than a primary machine. And most importantly, they'd run the numbers every year together. If the debt ever started to feel like it was getting away from them, they'd make changes before it became a crisis. It's not what I wanted, Michael said. It's not what I wanted either, Robert admitted. But maybe that means it's right. They shook hands on it there in the dark, surrounded by the smell of smoke and burned wheat. Now, here's what happened next, and I'm telling you this because I think it matters. 3 weeks later, they drove to a farm auction up in Smith County, where a farmer was retiring. They bought a 2001 John Deere 9650 STS with 620 separator hours on it for $148,000. It needed some work. Rear tires were shot. Feeder house chain needed replacing. A few sensors were glitchy, but the core machine was solid. They spent another $12,000 getting it field ready. The harvest of 2004 proved the investment was right. They cut 1,800 acres of wheat in 11 days, including time for repairs and maintenance. The old case would have taken 18 days minimum. The yield mapping showed them variability in their fields they'd never known existed. Some spots consistently producing 20 bushels per acre more than others. That information alone probably saved them $8,000 in wasted fertilizer over the next couple of years. But here's the other thing. They kept the case 1460, fixed the shaft properly, went to the whole machine, and used it as a backup. And in 2006, when the John Deere threw a rotor belt on the last day of harvest and they had 50 acres left to cut before a storm came in, they fired up that old case and finished the job. Robert Brennan retired in 2015. Michael took over farm operation, and by that time they were running a newer John Deere, a 9607 STS they bought used in 2011. The 9650 they'd purchased in 2004 was still in the shed, still functional, still used occasionally. The case 1460 was finally retired in 2009 after 28 years of service, and it sits now in the back of the machine shed like a monument to stubbornness and survival. The farm never took on debt it couldn't handle. Through wheat market volatility, through droughts, through all the challenges that came, they made their payments, they adapted, they survived. I'm telling you this story because I think it captures something essential about American agriculture in the early 2000s, and really about farming in any era. The tension between old ways and new technology, between caution born of hard experience and the necessity of adaptation, between fathers who remember the bad times and sons who only see the future. According to USDA census data, between 1997 and 2012, American agriculture lost more than 90,000 farms. Operations that couldn't make it, that couldn't adapt, or that chose to sell out while they still could. The farms that survived were the ones that found a way to balance tradition with innovation, caution with calculated risk. The story of Robert and Michael Brennan is really the story of thousands of farming operations across the country, working out these same tensions, making these same hard choices. Not always in the middle of fire, not always with the same dramatic timing, but facing the same fundamental questions. How much risk is too much? When does caution become paralysis? How do you honor the past while building for the future? Before I wrap up, let me tell you what else was happening in agriculture in 2003 that connects to this story. The precision agriculture revolution was fully underway. GPS guidance systems were becoming standard on new equipment. Yield monitors were showing farmers data about their fields that previous generations could only guess at. According to agricultural engineering research from that period, farms that adopted precision agriculture technology were seeing efficiency gains of 15 to 25%. That's not hypothetical. That's documented data. But here's the other side of that coin. The cost of that technology was creating a divide in American agriculture. Large operations with access to capital could invest in the newest equipment, gain efficiency advantages, and expand. Smaller operations that couldn't afford the technology were being squeezed out. The Brennans, with their 2,400 acres, were right in the middle, big enough to need modern equipment, small enough that the debt was genuinely dangerous. This is the reality of modern farming that doesn't always make it into the conversation. It's not just about hard work or good land or even good luck. It's about access to capital, about timing your investments right, about balancing the need for technological advancement against the very real risk of financial overreach. If you lived through this era, especially if you were farming or involved in agriculture, I'd love to hear your perspective in the comments. Did you face similar decisions about equipment? Did you go new or used? How did you balance the pressure to modernize against the risk of debt? And for those of you who are younger or who aren't from farming backgrounds, what do you think you would have done in Robert's position? Would you have bought the new combine? Stuck with the old one? Found a middle path? The comments section is really where these stories come alive, because every farm, every family has their own version of the story. Share yours. Tell us what equipment decisions shaped your operation. Tell us about the ones that worked out and the ones that didn't. And if you're getting value from these stories, if they're helping you understand this crucial period in American agricultural history, or just giving you a glimpse into a way of life that shaped this country, I'd appreciate it if you'd subscribe. I spend weeks researching each of these stories, digging through USDA data, talking to people who lived through these times, checking equipment specifications and historical contexts. My goal isn't just to entertain, though I hope these stories are engaging. My goal is to preserve a part of American history that's disappearing, to document the challenges and choices that farm families faced and how they navigated them. One more thing before I close. If you're a farmer, or if you grew up in farming, take a second and leave a comment about what farming was like for you in the early 2000s. What was the technological leap that changed your operation? What was the scary decision that paid off, or didn't? Because these stories matter. They're part of the fabric of American history, and they deserve to be remembered. The son begged for a John Deere STS 9650 in 2003. The father had the old case combine repaired. In the end, they both got what they needed. Progress without recklessness, tradition without stagnation, and a farm that survived to see another generation. That's the story. Thanks for listening. I'll see you in the next one.